आप ये मत कोशिश किया करिए कि यू हैव टू कम फर्स्ट, आपको पहला आना है। आप ये कोशिश करिए कि मैं स्लो बोल के साफ बोल के कितना अच्छा बोल पाती हूँ। यहाँ पर कंपटीशन हमारा ज़्यादा बोलने का नहीं है, अच्छा बोलने का। स्टैंडेबल बोल रहे हैं ना, वैभव पांडे थोड़ा सांस लेके बोलना है, ठीक है?
हाँ ठीक।
स्टार्ट नाउ।
I began to come, I began to go, I began to jump, I began to run, I began to drive, I began to sleep, I began to slap, I began to live, I began to life, I began to fly, I began to run, I began to share, I began to search, I began to put, I began to cut, I began to say, I began to do, I began to count, I began to feel, I began to feel, I began to fly, I began to count, I began to ask, I began to abused, I began to buy, I began to ask for, I began to save, I began to.
Yes. How many? You have to count, okay? Start.
He began to run, he began to come, he began to go, he began to touch, he began to break, he began to pluck, he began to teach, he began to learn, he began to say, he began to told, he began to weep, he began to cry, he began to laugh, he began to smile, he began to put, he began to keep, he began to run, he began to sleep, he began to sleep, he began to decorate, he began to play, he began to stop, he began to start, he began to open, he began to close, he began to
Stop.
ही से बोला है ना सर, ही began.
काउंट आपको करना है, ठीक है? स्टार्ट.
He began to ask, he began to ask for, he began to arrive, he began to count, he began to beat, he began to bite, he began to burn, he began to boil, he began to buy, he began to call, he began to cry, he began to cross, he began to decorate, he began to die, he began to do, he began to dig, he began to deposit, he began to fly, he began to fight, he began to feed, he began to feel, he began to feel, he began to live, he began to live.
Stop. लास्ट वाला नहीं काउंट करेगा, ठीक है? अरे क्योंकि बाल छोड़ देता हूँ मैं. चलिए स्टार्ट राजा.
He began to ask, he began to expect, he began to arrive, he began to abuse, he began to expect, he began to beat, he began to bind, he began to believe, he began to beg, he began to borrow, he began to buy, he began to ask, he began to complain, he began to count, he began to cry, he began to confuse, he began to save, he began to say, he began to ran, he began to reply, he began to revenge, he began to return, he began to live, he began to live.
ये भी लाइव बोल दिया. लाइव.
I began to ask, I began to ask for, I began to abuse, I began to accept, I began to boil, I began to bind, I began to bite, I began to burn, I began to select, I began to search, I began to search, save, I began to jump, I began to stand, I began to sit, I began to watch, I began to look, I began to see, I began to feel, I began to feel, I began to close, I began to open, I began to beat, I began to revenge, I began to arrive, I began to drive, I began to work, I began to come, I began to go, I began to slap, I began to sleep, I began to jump, I began to fight, I began to type, I began to drink, I began to drive, I began to sit, I began to swim, I began to sing, I began to eat, I began to
Start.
I began to pray, I began to visit, I began to worship, I began to come, I began to go, I began to cry, I began to listen, I began to jump, I began to fly, I began to move, I began to delete, I began to credit, I began to deposit, I began to delete, I began to cut, I began to paste, I began to dispatch, I began to receive, I began to
Stop. बस. How many? बहुत बढ़िया, बहुत पहले से बहुत अच्छा इम्प्रूवमेंट है. 18. कुछ रिपीट है? स्टार्ट. Okay. You have to count. Okay. Start.
I began to ask, I began to ask for, I began to arrive, I began to come, I began to go, I began to jump, I began to run, I began to walk, I began to listen, I began to see, I began to watch, I began to jump, I began to sleep, I began to slap, I began to abuse, I began to wear, I began to bind.
अच्छा, जब ये एस बोल रही थी मुझे याद आया, अनु जी आप ना एस को ई जल्दी बोले, स्लीप बोलते हैं आप, मैं देखा काम के स्लीप है ना, स्लैप ऐसे.
He began to come, he began to go, he began to sleep, he began to slap, he began to select, he began to save, he began to say, he began to ask, he began to ask for, he began to ask for, he began to lead, he began to live, he began to look, he began to move, he began to make, he began to boil, he began.
थोड़ा सा एनर्जेटिक दिखाना है कविता, ठीक है?
16 हुआ सर, उसमें से 1 माइनस.
ओके, 1 माइनस 15.
You began to call, you began to look, you began to jump, you began to ask, you began to sleep, you began to slap, you began to call, नहीं, ask for, you began to क्या बोलते, call, you began to slap, you began to sleep, you began to arrive, you began to नहीं, you began to, याद नहीं आ रहा है.
बस अब याद आएगा.
To ask, you began to ask for, you began to arrive, you began to bite, you began to buy, you began to cough, you began to cross, you began to cry, you began to love, you began to live, you began to like, you began to jump, you began to do, you began to sleep, you began to slap, you began to catch, you began to fly.
Now.
You began to go, you began to come, you began to ask, you began to ask for, you began to call, you began to pray, you began to drive, you began to come, you began to save, you began to say, you began to drive, you began to drink, you began to call, you began to close.
बस क्लोज हो गया है ना, काम करिएगा. स्टार्ट.
You began to go, you began to come, you began to leave, you began to leave, you began to ask, you began to ask, you began to sleep, you began to sleep, you began to come, you began to call, you began to drink, you began to drive, you began to look, you began to move, you began to cut, you began to put, you began to jump, you began to design, you began to
Stop. Let's start now.
He began to ask for, he began to ask, he began to sleep, he began to slap, he began to count, he began to drive, he began to small, he began to smoke, he began to slap, he began to move, he began to slide, he began to
Stop. लास्ट वाला क्या था? फ्लाइट. लाइफ मुझे समझ नहीं आया, आप लोग बताइए.